blessed sunny day here in Chicago, the day of Pentecost, where Orthodox Christians around the world celebrate the descent of the Holy Spirit. I'm joined today for another great conversation by two colleagues, but also very good friends of mine. I consider them as my brother and sister. And as we did with the conversation with Gail Wallachek, I'm going to have a hard time referring to them by their last names because I'm used to calling them by their first name. But in any event, we're joined today by two very good friends and professionals of the Orthodox Church, Professor Elizabeth Prodromou and Professor Alexandros Kyrou, just to give you all a little bit about each of them. Dr. Prodromou is a faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she directs the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. And Professor Kyrou is a professor of history and the director of the program in East European and Russian Studies at Salem State University. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kyrou and Dr. Prodromou. Welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Your Eminence.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence.
Chronia Pola to you both and to your family and friends up in Boston. I miss our friends up there in Arlington, Mass. My old landlords there especially. So we are having a conversation about basically, what the church is and what our experience in the church is today. I know the title of today's event is called Making Lemonade Out of Lemons. So usually we say that when we have something sour or something that we weren't planning. It's, lemons, there's not much. Lemons are just lemons, right? There's nothing exciting about lemons. But depending on what you do with them, you can make something that's really enjoyable, like lemonade. So, we can say that our lemons this past, quarter, we could say the last 3 months almost, has been COVID-19 and the coronavirus and the fight and against it and what we have been enduring during this time because of the coronavirus. And I know that many of our people are really struggling. I'm struggling with it. It's very tough. Everything from the measures that the state has put in place to help keep us safe and mitigate the risk of infection. But also, being away from our parish homes has been really, really tough for all of us. It hasn't been fun, I can say, as a hierarch, being in a church that's empty and looking out to a camera. But here we are. And on the, right at the verge of re-entering our churches slowly, we wanted to have a conversation. And so we would really appreciate you drawing from your experiences as academics and professionals in the academy, but also drawing from your experiences as Orthodox Christians in the parish of St. Athanasios and as in general as Orthodox Christians that attend church regularly. By the way, everyone, if you didn't know, Aleko and Elizabeth are married. So they use their own last names, of course, professionally, but they're married. They have a wonderful daughter, Sophia, and again, I feel like I'm part of their own house. So this is a bit difficult to interview them or to talk to them like this because we're usually yelling at each other. But in any event, so why don't we start off, Elizabeth, with you? I have just a general question. Right now we've gone about 3 months worshiping collectively, but in a new format using the digital platform. It was kind of very weird in the beginning. We have all, I think, gotten accustomed to it. You go online now and you can see your church streaming its services. But how has the shift to the digital service and worship opened up, we would say, new opportunities, new vistas for how we think about and experience what it means to be united as one body?
Thanks, Your Eminence, first of all, for inviting me and Aleko to speak with you. And I would add, we're not only yelling at each other, we're usually doing that over food. So after prayer and then food. So it's wonderful to be with you. And also, Chronia Pola for today's Pentecost. Thank you for the notion of making lemonade out of lemons. Because I think, for all of us, the COVID-19 experience has it's been extremely difficult. I mean, that doesn't even begin to capture it. And it's also been marked by tragedy. Many of us have lost people that were close to us, and then we also grieve for people that we don't know who've lost their lives. So it's been a very difficult time. And as far as being part of the church and being the church, one of the things that I've found very interesting about this whole experience is that it's forced us to really sort of reflect on what it means to be church. And although there's all of the downside and the difficulty of COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's also created an extraordinary opportunity for us to think about how we are as church and how we want to be as church. And that goes to the discussion about digital format. I think the digital format, the question of worshiping in digital form or online, is probably the first sort of reality check that this pandemic would reshape the way we all live. And although at the beginning of the pandemic, this shift to only online, I think was very, it was disruptive in many ways, and it was alien in many ways. As the time has passed, I think, from my perspective, the notion of ecclesial as digital and digital as ecclesial has made more sense. And simply by that, I mean that well before the pandemic, we were all using digital mechanisms and tools and platforms to learn and participate in and practice our faith. So we all use our cell phones, we all use our laptops or our desktops or whatever mode of computer that we use. We use our iPads. We've seen priests and deacons in church reading the epistle and gospel readings from their iPads. We talk to each other. There's the famous photo of the monk on Mount Athos, on his cell phone, and in the background is a beautiful monastery. So I think, the notion that this is somehow different with worshiping online, we need to sort of put that in perspective and realize what's different really is that here we didn't much have a choice, or we did have choices, but we made the choice to worship online in order to protect each of our fellow, believers, and to protect every person around us. And I think, that choice question is what for me has been very different. And then I would just add one more thing, and I'll turn it over to Aleko. But the worshiping online, to me, has really made me more purposeful and more thoughtful and more focused. All of the things we say we should do when we pray, that's what the digital experience of worshiping online has done. We had to choose to go online. We had to, turn off all pop-ups. We had to shut our phones. We had to make sure that the only thing that we were focused on was what was happening and what we were all experiencing on our screen. And I think that, that centering on Christ and the act of praying, even when we couldn't pray by seeing each other, to me that was very, very useful, because I want to carry that forward. And finally, the other thing is the notion that we might be looking at our screen here in Bedford, Massachusetts, or you in Chicago, Illinois, at the same time as someone was doing the same in any other place in our state, in our country, and on the planet. We say that we're a global church. We say that we're all part of the church because of our faith in Christ. And yet they're where we were doing that, invisibly, but all together. And I think, again, for me, that's the lemonade that's coming out of the lemons of, in some ways, being required to go digital for a while. And I think we should, at least from my perspective, I want to hold on to those positive things and also think about the ways in which using digital format has brought the church to people who might not otherwise be able to get to the physical church. So it needn't be black and white, all or nothing. I think there are so many important lessons we can take from this digital experience. I don't know, Aleko, if you wanted to add. I'm sorry I rambled for a while.
Your Eminence, like
rambling is permitted here, okay?
Yes.
It's okay.
Thank you, Your Eminence. Your Eminence, much like Elizabeth, I'd like to thank you for this warm invitation to participate in this dialogue today. But I would like to offer one small corrective to your very kind introduction, and that is that you're absolutely correct to recall that when we do gather together, typically, it does involve considerable yelling. But I'd like to be precise and parcel out one simple fact, and that is that yelling is a kind of duopoly shared between you and Elizabeth, and I tend to be more an observer to those confrontations than a participant. And
well, we're Greek, so we always speak loudly, so it's not really yelling. It's just the volume is high.
Yeah, in fact, Elizabeth reminded me of that very fact today by telling me that I sound like a radio that never stops playing. And that's
exactly like that. But on the digital front, anything on digital?
On the digital front, I think Elizabeth has said a great deal that offers brilliant observation about how digital technology has helped to strengthen our connection to the church in the midst of this pandemic. There's nothing more I'd like to add to that at this point, because I know, Your Eminence, you have many questions for us.
Can I just can I add one other thing before? The longing to be in the church, the space of the church, that came with the inability for all of us to be in the church, that feeling of longing to worship in person together is something I think I don't ever want to lose. And for all of us, I think everyone has experienced that. So that, the digital substitute is simply that. It's a substitute, but it reminds us of how precious it is to be able to come together live. And so for me, that's another, sort of, if the lemons were the inability to get there, they reminded us of how much we need each other, and we must make the effort, the conscious effort, whenever we are able to be together, to never take that for granted. And that's something very beautiful for me from this experience. And also to see people worshiping online in different languages. I mean, again, the sort of purposefulness of using the digital modality. We saw, here it's Pentecost, we saw all the voices of the church around the planet through the digital medium. And to me, that's a gift that, we were given, and we have to sort of ruminate on it and how to use it moving forward responsibly and respectfully.
Yeah, I will say that, this is very similar to, I'm assuming this is how people felt when the printing press came about and we had Bibles finally, and, people had their own copy of it, and they didn't have to wait to go to church to hear the Holy Gospel, but they could read and reflect at home. I will say that one of the amazing things that I've noticed is a lot of people who I know were not regular church attendees. It's not good. But that's where they are in their own growth. They many times have said to me, in passing, I tuned in to hear the Holy Week service. So I got I was on Holy Wednesday, or I was on, my family and I tuned in on Sunday. And I'm thinking to myself, these are people who probably never would have heard anything at all, during this time, because they were not regular churchgoers. We have to help them get to that point. But what we see is that there are people who took advantage of it. I know it was hard for many of us to be able to sit there and look at the screen. Like you said, intentionally, you have to turn everything off. We told people not to sit there in your pajamas, but to get ready as if you're going to church, to stand when the gospel reading is being read. And so to have some sort of similar experience as you can when you're physically present, of course, not through the sacramental life, but in other words, understand that you are not just watching Netflix. But there were so many people who I think could use this as a day one in their spiritual lives now, right? And I think you're right in terms of the longing to come back to church. It's really there, and I can see how excited people are to return to their homes. And even if there's 30 people or 50 people or 70 people that are permitted at this time, it's a precious time for all of us. But I wanted to just move to our next question and remind everyone that, Aleko, you are currently a sufferer, a member of the parish council, so you are commiserating with others around the planet who are serving as members of the parish council. And Elizabeth, you are a survivor of the parish council. So you both have parish council experience. And we are looking at our parishes. We work closely with them. Once a week, we have a meeting with our parish council presidents and clergy. And we talk about different things. But one of the major issues that we're looking at is, of course, the finances of our parishes, and how COVID-19, the coronavirus, has really had a negative impact on our financial condition of our parishes. And it's not just a hardship. I mean, I think in many instances, depending on how long this goes, this can be a crisis, an existential crisis for many of our churches around the world, I would say, not only in the Chicago metropolis. But Aleko, what would you say? How can we develop a more sustainable economic model, or models, maybe multiple models, that will allow us to have vibrant communities, but that are also consistent with the teachings of the church? I mean, many people think that when you talk about money, it's business and secular, and it doesn't have anything to do with the church. But we know that that's not true. So, what do you recommend?
Well, Your Eminence, first of all, you're right to point out that I enjoy the blessing of serving on my parish council, and I also bear that cross simultaneously. And this has been a concern for our parish council, as I will take for granted, has been a topic for conversation across the country in most parishes. Our parish, I suspect, like most parishes, is not blessed with an endowment. It is a parish that carries a measure of debt in the form of a mortgage. And although we have been very successful in grappling with the very difficult financial consequences of the pandemic, we are confronted with what was a very serious obstacle to the sustenance of our annual budget, something that is really the centerpiece of our income generation, apart from rental property and giving from stewards. And here I'll speak to what I think is a ubiquitous Greek American and Greek Orthodox paradox, and that is the Greek festival. Notice the absence of the word Orthodox from that phrase and that practice, that has become now a nationwide tradition. Our churches, when they were first established in the late 19th century and early 20th century, were subject to nativism. Being Greek in the public sphere was not something that was widely celebrated, and it certainly wasn't something that drew the curious celebratory interest of the general population beyond the immigrant community. Greek festivals are a fairly recent phenomena. We don't even really know their history. We don't know where the first festival took place. We don't know in what metropolis, then diocese, the festival first emerged. We don't know how they grew from one community to another. But what we do know is that they're both ubiquitous, and that they have become a source of vital. Well, it's the annual Greek festival that many, if not most, parishes rely on for their financial and economic survival. And the onset of this pandemic, the continuation of shutdowns across summer and presumably early fall, has meant that communities have been forced, as we have in our little town of Arlington, Massachusetts, to cancel our annual festival, which means that the single largest source of income for the parish is no longer available to us. In terms of how does one respond to that crisis, Your Eminence, I wish I had an answer for you that could be summed up in a simple phrase. Because if that were the case, we wouldn't be facing this as an ongoing problem. But I think what we can do is look to successes in the past. We've been in the present trapped in our own success, and that's why I refer to the festival as a paradox. It's proven to be so remarkably successful that our communities have grown dependent on this one annual event to subsidize the greater part of our parish budgets. But there are models for success. Those models were realized before the emergence of the annual Greek festival. And I think if we look to successful models that not only sustain churches, but were productive enough to create established communities and build the first churches, certainly in the first half and in the middle of the 20th century, we see a path toward financial stability. And what that means is relying on stewards and stewardship. to ensure that parishes continue and that they thrive. We've grown unaccustomed to sustaining, to satisfying, and responding to our own needs because we've turned to resources outside the community, capital that's funneled into our community through festivals to sustain our needs. We have to recognize that we have a history of success in maintaining our own communities, building thriving communities, and we have to return to that well-established model. So beyond the successes of the first half and the middle of the 20th century, Your Eminence, I'm sure there's ample opportunity to build on those, but I think we need to look to the past as we prepare for a future where the festival is something not only we can't rely on, but frankly, in my view, something we should not rely on. Because if anything, this recent experience has demonstrated our economic vulnerability as communities. We've essentially allowed ourselves to become a one industry town. We're dependent on one economic activity, one form of economic output to sustain ourselves. And I think all of us will agree that is not a very sound model for stability or success into the future.
Well, I think it definitely isn't. We know that it isn't. We've always said it isn't, but now we've seen it, right? And so, Elizabeth, I'm going to let you offer some of your thoughts, but I wanted to put a plug in here and remind everyone that our metropolis is helping to raise funds to help our parishes that are experiencing the most distress during this time. And anyone who would like to go online and make a contribution, as small or great as you'd like, you can go to chicago.goarch.org/donate. And one of the things we've seen is the parishes that have a sustainable kind of economic giving model, whether it's stewardship or tithing. We have several in our metropolis where there's tithing actually going on. Many of those parishes have offered assistance to their sister churches, which is wonderful to see. They've stepped up. They've said, even though we can't have, many of those churches don't even have a festival, by the way. The strongest churches don't even have one. They've stepped up and said, here's some money toward our sister churches that are going to need the help. And it's been great. And I think that the longing that, Elizabeth, you mentioned to come back to church, people need to understand, if you want your church, if you want this parish that's local, then, we all have to help pay for it. I mean, it comes down to that. It doesn't, money doesn't grow on trees, and we don't have a state that's, that funds it. If we really want our parishes, we ourselves have to help fund them. And if we don't, then, the inevitable is just, one more crisis away from, having some very difficult conversations with our people. But Elizabeth, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, just a couple of brief points. One is looking to the past to sort of seek models that worked. I mean, if we think of, the origins of Greek Orthodoxy in this country, or Orthodoxy more generally, and the growth of churches, local churches, that then, became a national phenomenon, those were largely built and expanded. Growth came from individuals who were not of means. I mean, our churches were not established for the most part, through endowments, of, wealthy philanthropists. Our churches were established through the sacrifice and the commitment of people of very limited means who saw the church as what we talk about, our family, and our family is part of the church family. And so our family needs something. As you would, build your own house, you would build and sustain your church. And I think that mindset is something that, the pandemic has forced us to, remind that mindset or recapture it. And the other thing is, like we mentioned, the sort of paradox of the festival. We're like a state that's a single commodity economy, and if there's an external disruption, an exogenous disruption, then your economy collapses. We're Saudi Arabia depending on oil exports, except we're churches depending on festivals. And I think, recognizing that vulnerability is important, but also recognizing the consequences of what that paradox has meant. It's meant that, as Aleko said, take out the word Orthodox, whether it's a Greek festival or a Russian festival or an Antiochian festival. I've said this to you many times, Your Eminence, and certainly to Aleko. I don't want to be the church that people think of as, oh yeah, they're the people with the good souvlaki, or they're the people with, the good piroshki, or the good falafel. That's a restaurant. Our churches aren't restaurants. And our devolution into that kind of an orientation where we share our heritage, of which we're all very proud, but little of our faith is something that I think we need to kind of recalibrate and rethink. And then just one last point, and that's that this notion of need. You talked about your parishes helping one another. That's the early church, right? Where the church, parishes were called on to help the Church of Jerusalem, and from Greece to Jerusalem. And I mean, we've come, I think, unfortunately, to internalize this notion that need is a sign of weakness. Well, we all have needs at certain time, and needing and responding to need that's a sign of our humility to help each other. And I think that's, again, something we just really we must recapture. So I think this is an opportunity to rethink the model, how we got to the model, and what the consequences, not only economic, but spiritual, have meant for our parishes as we've become these kind of single commodity, ecclesiastical models at the local level.
Yeah, and we can move on, but I would just say, one of the things that I have seen, I'm sure you've seen it as well, is how parishes have found or reestablished or increased their philanthropic or outward-looking capacity. Yeah. One would think that, when you go through a crisis, you're always looking to yourself, and we go into a state of, survival of the fittest, this Darwinian model of a church. And I found in our churches across our metropolis, they have stepped up not only to give to other parishes, so that's kind of helping your sister church, but also helping others in need outside of the church itself, in helping those in the world, whether it's making masks or distributing food to underserved communities. I think that this pandemic really has helped us make this type of lemonade as well. So it's not just, let's have an economic model that helps us be strong, but our people are, while we're trying to do this, they're also looking at how to help their neighbors outside of the church be well and healthy and strong. And many of the sacrifices we've made as a church during this time, including not being able to go to church, was, they were done with keeping our neighbor in mind, the non-Orthodox neighbor. So we've talked about kind of the digital opportunities. We talked about the economic model, but I think much of what we are looking at is also, kind of forcing us to reevaluate the importance of leadership. And so, Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you, in light of the program at Fletcher, the executive education program in strategic leadership and transformative action, which many of about 20 members from our metropolis across the 6-state metropolis were able to participate in. And I was one of those fortunate enough to learn from and grow from that incredible program that was funded by the Faith Endowment. Can you tell us a little bit about the importance of leadership, whether you want to talk about, political government leadership or church leadership or leadership in general in the midst of a pandemic?
Thank you, Your Eminence. I'll just say a couple of things. One is, I think that this pandemic has taught us that brave, courageous, but also compassionate and loving leadership is something that must come from certainly our, civil and political leaders, but also from our church leaders. And I think the pandemic has also underscored the fact, certainly in the non-church space, that the brave, courage, loving, compassionate leadership is something we all need to work on. And I say that outside the church and society more general. But inside the church, I think the pandemic has underscored the fact that leadership is about service. We talk about servant leadership, but as you rightly pointed out, some of the work that our churches are doing during this pandemic is to serve those most in need. And those oftentimes are outside the the church. And so leadership really is about seeing those who are in need and responding to them. And leadership, I think also we've seen in the pandemic, it comes at all levels. And we've seen that in our parish, and we've seen it in our churches, and I think we see it in society. I mean, leadership, isn't about station. Leadership is about a way of thinking and being responsible to your fellow human being. So we talk about first responders, or we talk about essential workers. I mean, all of these people, to me, they are demonstrating a kind of leadership because they are concerned with the fate and the survival oftentimes of their fellow human beings. And that is a kind of a model of servant leader, I think. And we talked in that in our faith-based executive ed program about the inverted pyramid, right? That oftentimes the leader is the person who's carrying everyone else on his or her shoulders. And I think that's something else that, to me, has been reinforced by this pandemic. Leadership comes in every sector. It comes in, at the church, whether we're hierarchs or clergy or lay people. And it's really about that mindset that we need to take care of our fellow human beings. The other thing I think that's been very clear in terms of the importance of leadership is that leaders can do enormous good and leaders can produce enormous damage. So the responsibility of leadership, the leader must be thoughtful, prayerful, and thinking, very humbly about the good, but also the possible damage, and work according to, the human rights principle of, do no harm. So these are just my thoughts on leadership. And again, I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity to rethink who is a leader and what is the purpose of leadership at the end of the day. I mean, leadership's about emptying ourselves to help others, not about building ourselves up. It's about invisibility as a leader, not about visibility and being in the front. The best leader is, I think, the quiet leader who does the most, but takes no recognition and seeks no recognition.
I appreciate the fact that you said the leader takes upon his or her shoulders the weight of the world, and I think it's important for us to remember that some of the strongest leaders out there today, and that I've seen here in the metropolis, have been women. And we had a great conversation recently with three such strong women: Valerie Karras, Anne-Marie Adams, and Anne-Marie Adams. And we spoke about, the myrrh-bearing women as leaders of the church. And we announced a new initiative, women's initiative, the Order of the Myrrh-bearing Women in the metropolis. So I'm glad that you mentioned that leaders can be a he or a she, especially in the church. Aleko, do you have any examples of kind of figures in your study of history that you would kind of point to as an ideal leader, especially during a pandemic?
Well, I do, Your Eminence, but we don't have to look to history. I can think of one such leader. By the way, like you, I could sense by your response that you were touched by the way that Elizabeth expressed her thoughts about what's central to leadership, especially as it's expressed in the church. She invoked things emotive and thoughtful that are demonstrative of central tenets of orthodoxy: humility, caring, love, regard for the other, connectedness to others.
You would think that that's like those are kind of obvious for leaders for us to have, or but then you look around and you say, well, I don't see that.
No, we don't.
It's very hard to see. Yeah.
Yeah, in our certainly postmodern secular world, leadership is defined in very different ways. It's defined in material and often in very harsh ways, antithetical, I think, to the human spirit and the conditions of importance Elizabeth reminded us of. I'll point to one such example of leadership to be found in the church today, expressed through a deep regard for historical memory, something that unfortunately I think is sorely missing from our community, writ large. and that is a sense of connectedness, not just to people, that is rich in our community, and it's lived in our community, but a sense of connectedness to our past, to the lessons we can draw from our past, and to our personal connectedness to the church in the past, which of course gives meaning to our present. If we look at this current crisis, the common language has been one that would suggest that this is a very unique, extraordinary circumstance, although initially I recall some reference, some comparison to the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. Well, I mentioned the latter because, again, pointing to one, and here I'll risk sounding sycophantic, but that's not my purpose, Your Eminence. I'll point to you for the benefit of your communicants in your metropolis, and I'm being quite sincere here. I came to learn not too long ago that you did something truly remarkable and wonderful that speaks to the kind of leadership that Elizabeth identified as so meaningful and important within the church. You, conscious of past suffering and our connection as a church and as a people to past suffering and loss, I came to learn that you not only visited, but you performed memorial prayers at the Evergreen Cemetery on the south side of Chicago, where there is a memorial that most of our people don't know exists. It's a God's memorial to the children of historic Saints Constantine and Helen on the old south side of Chicago before it moved into the suburbs. In 1918, 1919, as you know, Your Eminence, some 161, I think it was, children from that community lost their lives to the influenza. And you, without drawing any attention to yourself, going essentially almost privately, went to Evergreen Cemetery and performed a beautiful act of remembrance, prayer, and memorial chant. That's leadership. That's a living example of what constitutes leadership. That's inspirational. And that act itself, and I do mean it's inspirational because it's inspirational not as a model for other hierarchs or other men of the cloth. It's a model for all of us. One of the things that's important about this crisis is it's reminded us of our own mortality. It's in remembering, it's in acknowledging death that our lives take on some meaning, have value. That's a fundamental Orthodox and philosophical tenet. And by remembering the lives of those who came before us, our lives in the present take on added value. So I want to thank you for that really noble and wonderfully humble act that you performed for the memory of those children and for all of us.
Namaste Kala.
Namaste Kala.
Thank you. Namaste Kala. I want to invite everyone, if everyone would like to ask the professors anything beyond what I'm asking, you could, of course, write your questions on Facebook. I am looking at the comments that are coming in. We have people from all over the world, by the way, who are following us today, including Greece and I think other parts of Europe. Like you mentioned that this isn't the first time the church has faced a pandemic. Obviously, I mean, the world has faced pandemics. It's not usually just a church, but it's the world. Do we have any kind of lessons that we could learn? I mean, there's much that's being talked about. You know, this is the first time, maybe in our memory, that a church is addressing a pandemic. I know that there were other pandemics in recent history, the H1N1 or the so-called swine flu and the bird flu. Those were, challenges that were facing communities at large, and the church really did not have much to say during those times because it didn't impact us, I would say, in the same way it impacted other communities, especially Asian communities in Asia. But what do you think that we can learn from the past? I mean, maybe not just from pandemics, but just the way we address illness, how we approach the person who's sick or the person who's dying. I remember reading the great book by Timothy Miller. I think it's Walking Corpses, I think it's called, or his study on the leper colonies in Byzantium. It's just incredible to see how the fathers of the church responded to the lepers, to leprosy in general. I mean, there was actually a race to see how many leper colonies or hospital leprosoriums could be established. And at the time, there was a race between the Orthodox and the Arians. Who was going to actually help those who were sick? Was it the Orthodox Church, or was it the other faction? And I mean, the one thing that stands out in my mind in that entire book is how Basil the Great would enter the leper colony, and he would go to the deepest part of that. So imagine going into, I don't know, Beth Israel Hospital, right? I mean, if we could think of a modern day, place where people go who are sick, right? Going into the depths of it. So the ICU, the intensive care unit where everyone, hazmat suits and everything. And he entered the deepest part, found the lepers, not only blessed them, as we would think we would do, read a prayer over them, but actually bathed them. And he bathed them, he anointed their wounds with his own hands with oil, and then rebound their wounds with gauze. And then not only it wasn't done there, I mean, and this is, what's so humbling. He then exchanged the kiss of peace with them. And these are people who were not entering the churches, but the church entered their home, entered their space. And I read that and I think to myself, I don't know if I could do that myself. I don't know that, first of all, we're not allowed to go and do it nowadays. You can't go into the hospital and just walk in. But the faith and the love that St. Basil had, to not be afraid and to really bring the church, to make the church present in the lives of these people, not just by building the leper colony, but by actually going in and treating the people and embracing them as a brother or a sister. I mean, to me is incredible. I think about that and I think, that he's a bishop of the church. I mean, and it's very right. People refer to St. Basil and point to him as being a bold leader because he went up to the emperor and said, "You've never seen a real bishop." There's an exchange, and you're a historian, so you could tell us the exchange between them. But really, that's not why he was a real bishop. It wasn't because he was bold enough to go head toe to toe with the emperor. It was because he was able to go into that leper colony. He was able to love the person who was rejected. So I think of that in terms of leadership. I think of that in terms of how do we respond to a pandemic as a community that embraces the sick, that embraces the frontliners. So I don't know if you have any kind of examples that come to mind about either of you, Elizabeth or Aleko, in terms of how should we respond as a church when it comes to these types of pandemics?
Well, Your Eminence, you made mention of Timothy Miller's most recent work. He is a brilliant scholar who has enlightened us a great deal about Byzantine civilization, an American scholar who also has a deep love of and understanding of Orthodoxy as well as Byzantium. His most recent work is one of many such similar works. Your Eminence, and I'll make mention just for the benefit of your audience that might have an interest in exploring this subject further, and in particular the works of Timothy Miller. Timothy Miller is renowned in the world of Byzantine studies for having published groundbreaking works. One deals with philanthropy. Another deals with the emergence of an institution that was created, driven by the spirit of orthodoxy and philanthropy, the orphanage in Byzantium. And in my view, one of his most seminal works, and it continues to resonate probably far more than any of his other works, which are very, very important, is a book on the emergence of the hospital in Byzantine society. Something that St. Basil played a direct part in, as you know, Your Eminence. And I mentioned the hospital, I mentioned the orphanage as Byzantine and Orthodox creations precisely because before we even address the question of what lessons might we learn from Orthodoxy's historical experiences with plague, with pandemic in the past, I think the first thing we need to do, and here I speak as a member of a community, what we need to do as a Greek Orthodox community in the United States is first learn our history. I think it is reasonable to assert that most of us don't know that the hospital was a Byzantine and Orthodox creation. That is in part the result of a misguided education that the West has produced as an alternative narrative that robs historical accuracy and denies Byzantium a fuller understanding. But it's also a function of our lack of regard for our own history. We assume that we know our history, and I'll paint a simple picture of the Greek American narrative for you, Your Eminence. The Greeks invent democracy. Alexander the Great conquers the Near East. We rule the world. We spread Christianity across the world. The Turks conquer us, and then we liberate ourselves. There's an enormous history. There's an enormous history that overlooks something called the Byzantine Empire, the world's longest-lived polity. That cultural and civilizational cauldron within which Christianity found its voice. Christianity found its ideas. And frankly, Your Eminence, I think if we look to our very long history as both a nation, Greeks, and as people adherent to Orthodoxy, we find ourselves in a unique position, and we can learn a great deal from our history. Before we as Greeks became Christians, we produced the first recorded observations of plague in human history. Thucydides, the great historian, most would concede the first historian, if you don't want to emphasize Herodotus, in his Peloponnesian Wars, he wrote extensively about plague in Athens. The Athenian plague of 431, typhus, brought into Athens first from Ethiopia through Egypt and into Greece. We have an incredibly detailed history of the bubonic plague. It is the first plague history that we have in literature, and it's recorded by Procopius, the official court historian to the Emperor Justinian, in the 6th century. And therein we find not only the ravaging effects of pandemic, we also find, among other things, both the state and the church's responses to pandemic, to plague. And what we see is a state that shows not an absence of concern for its citizens, but a state that defers to the church to respond to this human and humanitarian crisis. And we see a similar response taking place in the 14th century when the more well-known plague that devastates Western Europe, returned to the bubonic plague in the 14th century, first enters Europe through Byzantium, devastates Constantinople, and by that time a much truncated empire. And what do we see? Profound similarities in the way that the church, in the way that Orthodoxy responds to the crisis and to the human needs that emerge from this crisis. It's not the state, it's the church that brings comfort, relief, medical care. It aims to sustain the population, not just spiritually, but physically. The church and the wealthy in Constantinople and in the empire's other cities and towns literally fed the city's populations. The church saw itself as having a moral and spiritual responsibility to respond to the crisis. And Procopius tells us something interesting, Your Eminence. Procopius tells us that people were very much affected by the church's responses. And those people who had, in a sense, apostatized, returned. Many of them returned to the church by virtue of how they saw the church live its principles. And he also talked about how Orthodox society seemed to re-embrace in a more invigorated way its commitment to orthodoxy. Now, of course, and this is Procopius, an historian who was deeply cynical, who loathed the very emperor he wrote about. And so we have to take his observations very seriously. But again, Your Eminence, excuse me, I've said far too long. I'm going to defer to Elizabeth.
Oh, this is great. This is like a history class. I love it.
Yeah,
I'm paying attention this time around.
All I would say here is that, again, like in so many other things, the Greek world and the Orthodox world, these two worlds, often one world, provide for the world writ large incredible historical experience about human response, institutional and faith responses to pandemic and plague.
Thank you, Aleko. Elizabeth, anything to add to that?
Lemons to lemonade. The pandemic allows us and forces us to reflect on how we can respond to the present by looking at our past. And as Aleko pointed out, we have an extraordinarily rich past. And your reflection also on the leprosariums, I think, is so instructive. We talked earlier about the economic model, and ultimately an economic model that's about what is the purpose of church. And as we see historically, the economics of the church were all about serving the people. Serving who? The ill and the infirm, the poor, the needy. I mean, people who today oftentimes are castigated and presented as, blamed for their own situation. The church responded with love and care, not with judgment. And I think, if we look at the ethos and the phronema of the church's institutional innovations, the medical school, what we would think about today, medical school, and the leprosarium and the hospital and the orphanage. I mean, the church wasn't judgmental. The church was there to serve and to be compassionate and loving. And I think, recapturing that, and I think the churches are recapturing that. Certainly, and I'm focusing more on the United States because we enjoy the luxury of living in the world's wealthiest country, in a society where we're accustomed, for better or for worse, to filling our every want immediately. And we've shifted to a model of want rather than to a model of giving. And so I think we look to our own institutions as we rethink what is our economic model and ultimately our purpose. And Your Eminence, you mentioned, again, the leprosarium. I was in Istanbul in January and with some visitors from the US, and we went to what were former Byzantine Orthodox churches, which are now converted to mosques. And one of them, one of the visitors was, excited to see that church had actually been, yes, a church, but had included an orphanage, a hospital, and a medical school. And so for me, one of the takeaways from that is the church itself never saw itself in contradiction with science. Maybe the church got some of the science wrong, undoubtedly, we know it did, got some of the science wrong, but the church never set up what we oftentimes hear today, and I think has been part of the conversation of the pandemic. It's either faith or science. The church didn't have that kind of a false dichotomy historically, and I don't think there's any need for us to have that today. Not that one should displace the other. Our faith is the center of our being and how we live our lives, but faith need not mean, and never has been in the history of the church, a rejection of science. And I think that's important for us to keep it in mind as we, go forward from, we're in the pandemic. We're not going forward from the pandemic. We're in the pandemic still. And so we're trying to respond now to the ongoing pandemic. And we have, examples, institutional examples that we can draw on. And the behaviors that you mentioned, maybe a leader who's afraid, but is also fearless, and the responsibility of leadership. Leaders are human. I mean, I wouldn't want to walk in the shoes of many of our leaders, whether religious or civic, but nonetheless, they have their own fears, but they also must be courageous or fearless in giving hope and setting examples to those around them. And I think that's, with Basil, that beautiful example you showed us, sort of that resonates, that willingness to be courageous, even if there may have been personal human fear.
Well, I think, Elizabeth, what you just said kind of summarizes what we're experiencing. We're in the pandemic. We're not post-pandemic. This isn't a theory anymore. We are in it. We're living it. We're experiencing it. We're being shaped by it. And I think also, what both of you have said shows that our response to a pandemic will shape the world. And it's so I like the example of the apostates coming back and to the church because of the response that the church had to a plague or to illness is so important for us to keep in mind that people are watching, people who have been, who for whatever reason walked away from the church or who are, considering the church or returning or joining the church for the first time. What we do as a community today, our response to the pandemic, if it is self-centered, people will walk away even more quickly than they were before. I mean, I have seen the best in people. I've seen, lemonade be made that tastes really good, just a great sugar added to it as well, and it tastes great on a nice summer day. But I've also seen, some sour, lemon juice being given around and passed around as if that's what Orthodoxy is about. And I think there's got to be a distinction between taking a bad situation and making the best you can out of it, and taking a bad situation and making it worse by our own ego and self-centeredness. I mean, we have, and I will say this, I mean, I'm not embarrassed or afraid to say it. I feel that as the Metropolitan, I've had to make choices, and some of those choices have been very hard. I know that I haven't pleased everybody, and I can even say, looking back in a few months or weeks from now, I probably will be able to see where I made mistakes, and will be able to respond better in the future. But I mean, sometimes the response from people is like so negative. And negative, not because they disagree with a decision that's made by the church, by an individual hierarch or a parish priest even. It's just negative because it's grounded on self-centeredness. People saying, it's my church. Why are you keeping me from my church? I have a right to go to my church. I should be able to receive the Eucharist. It's mine. It's like, wow, this is so unorthodox. I mean, obviously we're dealing with changing times and a situation no one was prepared for. I mean, that's, one lesson is we have to always be prepared for things like this. But I mean, the response when it's Christ-like, it's beautiful. It's lemonade. When it's I would say tyrannical and not Christ-like, it is more like lemons and lemonade. And so I think we all have to be able to say, okay, I made a mistake. I was like this. I made a wrong decision, or I responded a bad way to a decision. Now we're going to keep moving toward Christ. And I think it's great that we're having this conversation on the Feast of Pentecost, because it was the Holy Spirit that really gave the disciples the grace and the courage to go out and to bring others to the church, to do the right thing, to care for the widows, to care for the orphans, to preach the gospel, to do all the things that Christ did. And we have this great opportunity to do it now during a pandemic, and we'll have the opportunity to continue doing it after the pandemic is, done. So I just, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or words for our people. There are some people who were here that were joining us that were Greek speakers, and they've said, can we say something in Greek? So I will say, εύχομαι σε όλους σας καλή Πεντηκοστή. Ακούσαμε από τους δύο καθηγητές πώς η Εκκλησία αντιμετωπίζει πανδημίες και αρρώστιες σήμερα αλλά και στο παρελθόν. Ακούσαμε παραδείγματα από την ιστορία του Βυζαντίου, από την αρχαία Ελλάδα αλλά και τη σημερινή εκκλησία σε όλο τον κόσμο, και εδώ στην Αμερική έχουμε μια μοναδική ευκαιρία να προσφέρουμε τον Χριστό σε αυτούς τους ανθρώπους που είναι πονεμένους, να ανοίξουμε τις πόρτες μας, να μην είμαστε άνθρωποι που έχουμε βάση στην εσωστρέφεια, αλλά να είμαστε άνθρωποι της αγάπης, το οποίο σημαίνει να δίνουμε τον εαυτό μας, να δίνουμε όσο μπορούμε στον συνάνθρωπο. So that was my little Greek plug. It's summarizing as best as I could all that we said in about 30 seconds.
That was an elegant summation.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
It was very good. Did you have any closing thoughts or words? Or
Your Eminence, I want to thank you for just allowing us sheer luxury of and enjoyment of being able to sort of reflect with you on Pentecost. I know that you have enormous responsibilities, so thank you for allowing us to spend the time, and also for prodding us to sort of think purposefully about how we are and can be church. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the question of masking. And we mask when we're out in public. We follow all the rules that have been recommended.
Oh, you mean I thought you mean putting on literally a mask?
No, masking. Yeah. Actually, that reminds me of another point I would make. But so we mask, and a lot of people don't mask. But, we're called in the church to, see the face of Christ in our neighbor, to look at the face of our neighbor and see Christ in our neighbor. And I would just say that if in the pandemic, Christ were to walk up to me, and I know that I or person X could be, an asymptomatic carrier of COVID-19, which can, has produced massive loss of life, would I want to be the transmitter of that unintentionally to Christ if Christ, that were my neighbor? And so I keep thinking, I have to remember always that we're called to seek our neighbor, Christ in our neighbor. And so as I would behave to Christ in this pandemic, I have to try to behave to my neighbor. I have to do my very best. And that's whether it's about wearing a mask or offering whatever we can, whether it's monetary, whether it's time, whether it's phone calls to people who are alone and who are grieving, people that they love and lost. I have to remember that's the face of Christ, and I must behave that same way. So that's, for me, one of the important sort of concluding observations. And the other one is something that was shared with me by a metropolitan in Europe, a metropolitan of the ecumenical throne in Europe. And he made me think about the question of external masks that we all now, hopefully wear so that we can take care of each other. But the other kinds of masks that maybe we were all wearing before the pandemic, and maybe we're wearing in the pandemic and we don't even know it, and then after the pandemic. So masks are both visible and invisible. And I think how we behave throughout this pandemic, and as we look back on it, we as church, how we are church, that will say a lot about each and every one of us, and whether we were wearing a mask all along and continue to do that, and we just don't see it or are unwilling to admit it. So those are my sort of two things that I would share with you confessionally, so the whole planet can hear.
Everyone heard it, so
That's right. Thank you. Yeah. And thank you for the Mere Bearing Women, the initiative. Thank you.
Well,
thank you for all the good things you do, Your Eminence.
Nice to kala, Aleko. Thank you. Please convey my love to Sophia. I can't believe I don't know how old she is now, but I remember playing Guitar Hero with her when she was, 4? 5?
Yeah, that's right.
She's 21 years old now, Your Eminence.
21 years old. That's crazy. I told her I was going to marry her when the time comes. She finds a good Greek boy.
Now she's subjected to planetary embarrassment from us having this conversation.
That's okay. They have a great daughter, Sophia, and she's 21. I don't think she's ready to get married yet, but when the time comes, we'll marry her. I want to thank everybody for joining us again for another conversation during this period of time where we spend a lot of time watching the screens. I do hope and pray that as things begin to open up around us in our daily lives, that we do our best to be careful, to protect those around us, loved ones, to wear a mask if we have to, when we have to, and just to keep us in your prayers. You're in my prayers out there, our people. I really can't wait to go back to church and see our people. I miss them. I miss them a lot. I miss my priests a lot, even though we have our weekly meeting every week on Zoom. I miss being with them and serving Divine Liturgy with them. So I really can't wait to be with all of you out there. Take your time, don't rush, and do your best. Okay, that's the best that we can do right now. But do your best, keep moving forward. Just a reminder again for those who wish and are able to visit our YouTube page and to subscribe and to like us, to share, comment. I don't know. There's a way for us to be able to offer more content using this platform. So please do your best. Go visit us. Google us on and search for our YouTube page and subscribe and share us on social media. And if you can, if you haven't already, or if you'd like to make an additional contribution to our parish relief fund, you can go to chicago.goarch.org/donate. And thank you again. Kalipe di Kosti.
Thank you, Your Eminence.